During the 1970s, a few more marginalized groups started to get a lot more vocal in their frustrations with the oppression and discrimination they were facing on a daily basis. LGBT, Indigenous, and disabled people, inspired by the work of the Civil Rights Movement, joined feminists, Blacks, Asians, and Latinas in engaging in activism with the goal of creating a more equitable world for everyone. It was also a time when Blacks, especially those living in cities, were finding themselves struggling against new problems and finding new ways of advocating for themselves through art. The Stonewall riots that started the night of June 28, 1969, are often said to be the start of the modern queer revolution. I wouldn't argue with that statement when it includes the word modern. Often, modern is left out, which ignores the work that was going on before the police raid inspired patrons to fight back. Part of why so many injustices against gay, lesbian, and transgender people through the 60s and 70s happened were because of laws that made public and private acts of homosexuality illegal, and laws that required a person to wear a minimum number of items of clothing that matched their gender. Gay bars and lesbian bars were consistently raided by police to arrest people for these acts. In the US, violation of these laws resulted in jail time. In the UK, violation of the laws could result in either jail time or probation that included chemical castration. Probably one of the most well-known victims of this was Alan Turing, considered the founder of computer science and inventor of the Turing machine, an early computer that also broke the Enigma code the Nazis used, which helped the Allies win World War II. Because Turing was caught with another man, he pled guilty to the charges and accepted probation and the chemical castration that came with it. Less than 2 years later, he committed suicide, likely due to what he had gone through as a gay man in England. Actions both part of and separate from the homophile movement took place in the decades and years leading up to Stonewall. Some of these were demonstrations that protested the exclusion of queer people, especially from employment and being able to serve openly in the military, and the mistreatment of queer people, especially actions taken to out them and then arrest them. Others were riots that happened because of police raids on gatherings and bars. Places like Cooper Donuts, the Black Cat, and the Patch, all in LA, were places where gay, lesbian, trans people, and/or drag queens were known to gather and be themselves. This made them targets for police departments who were trying to rid their cities of perverts, as queer people were often referred to at the time. While there were many peaceful demonstrations, including sit-ins, queer people were not afraid to fight back when necessary. While the homophile movement was acknowledged by the queer movement during and after Stonewall, another group tends to be ignored: transgender people. Transgender people, especially trans women, were fighting back against discrimination, transphobia, and violence before Stonewall happened. The violence directed toward them was different than what was directed at gays and lesbians, especially toward those who did not pass as cisgender. One example of trans people fighting back is the Compton's Cafeteria riot in August 1966. Compton's Cafeteria was a restaurant chain in San Francisco, and the Tenderloin location was the site of the riot. At the time, the Tenderloin is where many marginalized people lived, including gays, lesbians, transgender women, and drag queens. Because of their identities, it was hard for them to get jobs, and many trans women ended up becoming sex workers to survive. They experienced discrimination and violence from both the police and their own clients because they were trans women. Since the cafeteria was open all night, many of these sex workers, especially the trans women who weren't welcome in the bars, would gather at the end of the night in an attempt to have a safe place to gather and rest before going to wherever they slept. This didn't keep them from being harassed by the police or others, but it did cut down on the harassment. Because of these repeated police involvements and not buying a lot of food while there, the cafeteria would kick them out. Eventually, the women were tired of being harassed and bullied and decided to fight back the next time the police came in to arrest them. This led to the riot and subsequent demonstrations and picketing outside the cafeteria. While the riot at Compton's Cafeteria is one of the more prominent examples of protest by the queer community in the 50s and 60s, it was never covered by the press. Word of these protests and riots spread via word of mouth across the country. There is no date for the Compton's Cafeteria riot because there is no record, not even police record, of the exact date of the riot. Those who were involved in the riot can't agree on an exact date, which is why it's usually cited as August 1966. Queer people across the nation kept protesting injustice and physically fighting back against violence from the police. The riots at the Stonewall Inn in June 1969 were a turning point in the efforts to draw attention to the homophobia queer people were subjected to in the U.S. at the time. The Stonewall Inn was a bar in New York City that was owned by a mafia family. In 1966, they turned it into a gay bar, as it was in a part of the city where a lot of queer people lived. But because liquor laws prohibited knowingly selling alcohol to gay people, the police were paid to overlook the bar's existence. But that didn't prevent them from raiding the bar periodically and arresting patrons. Like other raids, patrons would be arrested, but some would try to resist, which would result in violence from the officers and getting arrested. But the night of the riot, the patrons refused to cooperate and be arrested. As the patrons and officers quietly waited for the patrol wagons to arrive after the raid, a crowd of onlookers started to form. These onlookers included a lot of street kids and drag queens and trans women who live and work in the area. The first people arrested and loaded into the wagons were mafia members, who the crowd had no problem with seeing arrested. As employees began to be loaded into another wagon, it is said that someone shouted, "Gay power!" while another started singing, "We shall overcome," all peaceful protests to the raid and arrests of queer people. Tensions started to rise, and things started to get physical. The crowd of onlookers kept growing at this time, including straight allies from nearby bars. Remember, this was 1969. There were a lot of people who were against police brutality and supported its resistance. Many say the onlookers are who really escalated things, likely because they had nothing else to lose and were fed up with being marginalized and discriminated against. Marsha P. Johnson, a trans woman and drag queen, is often credited as the person who threw the first brick, but in interviews she said she arrived after the riot had begun. But she and others stayed to support the protest. While the riot that night had been dispersed around 4 a.m., protests and rioting happened again the next night. Partially because newspapers, including the New York Times, covered the riot the first night. People had come throughout the day to see what had happened that morning. Some existing gay groups didn't support these riots and protests, partially because of who was participating in the protesting: effeminate gays, drag queens, and trans women. But soon after, many groups around the country and across the world realized that the riots drew attention by the mainstream, and they could benefit from that and started to organize protests about the discrimination and violence the gay community was facing. The Stonewall riots have left a legacy in the queer community. The next year in New York, Christopher Street Liberation Day was organized for the first anniversary. The Stonewall Inn is located on Christopher Street. Other celebrations and marches were planned for throughout June. These became the foundations for today's Pride Month and Pride marches and activities. Organizations around the country for LGBTQIA+ people are named Stonewall, Stonewall Columbus being a prominent example. Stonewall Columbus's Pride event has become the second largest Pride event in the Midwest. The Stonewall Inn itself and the surrounding area has become a National Historic Landmark, the first LGBTQIA+ site of its kind, and is now a visitor center and museum. Both New York City and state have also made the site historic landmarks. Despite all the discrimination faced by gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgender people because of their differences, they weren't a united community. Even today, there isn't necessarily a unified LGBTQIA+ community. At the time, if there was a grouping of initials of terms being used, it would have simply been LGBT. This is why there were transgender rights groups that worked on their own and often were addressing both queer and straight audiences when fighting for equality. And, as I've already said in this video, transgender people were practically ignored by gays and lesbians. Being a masculine lesbian or an effeminate gay were accepted, but being transgender was less accepted, even to the point where trans men were not as widely known about as trans women were. In 1970, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, STAR, was formed by two trans women, Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, both of whom were activists and both were part of the Stonewall riots. While STAR was only around for 3 years, they fought for trans rights as well as the inclusion of trans people in the queer movements of the time, including in the celebrations that quickly became Pride. STAR was one example of the work trans people, especially women, were doing to be seen as part of the overall queer movement in addition to advocating for themselves. Another example of discrimination faced by queer people, especially at the time, is parental rights. It was not uncommon for women to get divorced and gain custody of their children. But it was also not uncommon for the fathers to fight for sole custody after finding out their ex-wife is in a lesbian relationship. Many women lost custody of their children simply because they are lesbian, even when the child or children being with their father would be worse for them. Judges thought that being around a lesbian relationship would be worse. And this is still happening today. If not for these activists putting their lives on the line to fight to be treated as equal to heterosexual, cisgender, gender-conforming people, who knows what LGBTQIA+ people would still be prevented from doing today. I have included links to articles below this video about various acts of activism and protest across the queer community, highlighting the depth and breadth of these movements if you want to learn more about them. Dean Kotlowski says in his article, one of the additional resources listed for this week, that, quote, the period from 1969 to 1977 saw both unprecedented civil disobedience by Native American activists and breakthrough initiatives to advance Indian rights, end quote. During this decade, Indigenous people in the United States resumed work to draw attention to the numerous ways the U.S. government discriminated against the people who were living on this land before white Europeans came along and took it away from them. The treatment of indigenous tribes during the first half of the 20th century both attempted to respect and further repress them. FDR, quote, enhanced tribal autonomy and self-government, end quote, giving the tribes more control. But in 1953, the House of Representatives passed a resolution that would have removed their autonomy and taken away their lands. The idea was that they would integrate into U.S. society this way, with no input from them, of course. President Nixon and his administration worked to reverse this and protect the rights of tribes, encouraged those on reservations to take more control over the federal programs there, and even settled claims with a few tribes. Many tribal leaders supported the administration and applauded these efforts. But those indigenous people living in cities and other places outside of reservations still felt ignored and left out by the government. Inspired by the activism of African Americans during the 50s and 60s, young indigenous people who were living in cities started the American Indian Movement, AIM, in 1968, supporting Red Power. Originally, AIM fought for indigenous populations who had been encouraged by the government to leave their reservations and move to cities to improve their lives. They felt that the legislation being passed was too narrowly focused on tribes and tribal lands, leaving those living outside of tribal lands and reservations out of the conversation. While they were told that moving to cities would improve their lives, they found themselves treated the same they had always been, poorly. Indigenous populations in cities were encouraged to assimilate into white culture, but that was hard to do when faced with the discrimination and racism present in that white culture. As AIM spread across the country, because by this time many indigenous people had been living away from tribal lands and authority for decades, its goals broadened to encompass the activism of all indigenous people, including the right to govern themselves autonomously on their reservations and sovereign tribal lands. One way that AIM differed from the civil rights movement was their rejection of integration. Blacks wanted to be able to live as equals alongside whites in the U.S. AIM reflected the feelings of many indigenous people of betrayal by the U.S. government's long history of broken treaties and attempts at assimilation presented as equality. AIM supported self-governing of tribes and self-determination for indigenous people, as well as protecting, saving, and restoring their cultures and languages that were disappearing because of assimilation efforts. AIM engaged in protests and demonstrations both on and off reservations, sometimes forcing bargaining with the government, as well as establishing centers to showcase their cultures so people could learn more about them. One of the high points of AIM and the Red Power movement was the occupation of Alcatraz Island. The group called themselves Indians of All Tribes and claimed the island under the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. They argued that the treaty allowed the Sioux to claim any surplus government land, which the island had been declared in 1964. There was talk of turning the island into a national park, which inspired Indians of all tribes to move. The occupation began on November 20th, 1969, with 89 people heading to the island, 14 making it past the Coast Guard blockade to begin the occupation. At its peak, there were 400 people living on the island, including families. They worked with what was already on the island, creating not only shelter, but a school and daycare for the kids, and a health clinic. Supporters brought food and other needed items to the island as much as they could, eventually resorting to canoes at night to get around the blockades. They painted messages all over the island, declaring it Indian land, using the language and art of various tribes, representing the diversity of the occupiers. The government did not work to remove them from the land, partially because of the backlash after the shootings at Kent State University in May 1970. Starting in 1970, people started to leave the island for various reasons, and the occupation soon dwindled. The last 15 people were removed from the island by federal marshals on June 11, 1971. After everyone was removed from the island, some of the painting done on the island was removed, some was simply left to the elements to fade away, erasing evidence of the occupation. In celebrating the 50th anniversary of the occupation, much of what was painted during the occupation was repainted and restored as the occupation became a part of the story told at the national park the island had become, including on their website. This occupation inspired protests and other occupations across the country. From November 3rd through 9th, 1972, after arriving in D.C. at the end of a cross-country walk called the Trail of Broken Treaties, about 500 members of AIM occupied the Interior Building in Washington, D.C., where the Bureau of Indian Affairs was located. They presented President Nixon with the 20 Points Position Paper, outlining their goals, largely aimed at restoring the rights of indigenous peoples and tribes. During the occupation, some took files about unfair deals, while others took artifacts to return to the appropriate tribes. On February 27, 1973, around 200 Oglala Lakota and AIM members occupied Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. They were protesting the U.S. government's broken treaties with indigenous tribes. The occupation lasted 71 days. On February 11, 1978, the longest walk began with a ceremony on Alcatraz Island that included loading a sacred pipe with tobacco. AIM led the 3,200-mile walk across the country to Washington, D.C., carrying the pipe the whole way. In addition to indigenous people, allies, including Muhammad Ali, Senator Ted Kennedy, and Marlon Brando, took part. The walk arrived in D.C. on July 15, 1978, where the pipe was smoked at the Washington Monument. This started a week of rallies across the city to draw attention to various issues, including proposed laws, political prisoners, and forced relocation. 30 years later, in 2008, the longest walk 2 happened, covering 8,200 miles across a northern route that was essentially the original route, and a southern route, crossing a total of 26 states between the two routes. Over 100 nations were represented, as well as other groups, including Maori people. These are a few of the high-profile examples of activism during the 1970s. While these actions drew a lot of attention to the problems of indigenous people, to indigenous people themselves, and shift the language around them from Indian to Native American, a lot of what they were advocating for hasn't happened. Which is why we still have indigenous activism continuing today, continuing to fight for the same rights that AIM and its allies were fighting for in the 70s. After World War II, there was a shift in how disability was treated in the US, partially due to the shock over how the Nazis embraced and implemented eugenics to eradicate Jews en masse, partially due to the number of veterans who came back from the war with physical and mental scars. The problem is, despite disability existing in this country since its beginning, there was very little accommodation made for people with disabilities, including legally. When the U.S. Civil Rights Act of 1964 was being debated, President Johnson declared, quote, "All members of the public should have equal access to facilities open to the public," end quote. But there wasn't a lot done to apply that statement to physical access. It was during this time that the disability rights movement started to come together. Before then, different groups were engaging in their own fights against discrimination. Blind, both big and little d deaf, physically disabled people, and parents of kids with disabilities were all engaging in their own fights with ableism separately. Watching and being a part of collective movements in the 60s, people with disabilities started to realize just how much discrimination they faced. Laws began to be enacted, giving more support to people with disabilities. But it wasn't until the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 that people with disabilities and the deaf gained a measure of equality with the temporarily able-bodied and hearing populations. The Rehabilitation Act prohibits discrimination in government programs and policies and hiring practices against people with disabilities, implicitly including the deaf. It also laid out the civil rights of people with disabilities of all ages, including in schools. It included accessibility in the technology developed and used by government agencies. The Rehabilitation Act was a big legal step forward for people with disabilities and the deaf. But enforcing the act was another story. The Rehabilitation Act did lay the groundwork for more expansive and effective legislation almost 20 years later, the Americans with Disabilities Act. 2 years later, in 1975, things changed for the better again. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which was renamed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, in 1990, was signed into law. Like much of the legislation that has been passed to create a more equitable country, the EHA came into being thanks to the civil rights movement. The desegregation of education based on race got people to start rethinking how children with disabilities were and weren't being educated in this country. Most schools weren't accessible, both physically and mentally, for most students with disabilities. Often there were separate schools or classrooms for children with disabilities. Separate was not always equal for students with disabilities. Some students were homeschooled because they could not easily leave their homes or needed more medical support than a school could provide, and often received a lesser quality education than their peers because homeschooling was not very regulated at the time. The EHA took on much of the financial burden public schools faced in educating children with disabilities, including creating the least restrictive environment for them to learn in, training educators to work with the students, and have as much of their education happen in the same classroom as their temporarily able-bodied peers. The term least restrictive environment has a very specific definition in IDEA. Children with disabilities, whether, quote, in public or private institutions or other care facilities, end quote, are in class with their temporary able-bodied peers and are only pulled out for separate schooling when they cannot keep up, even with accommodations. The goal is to have children in class together no matter what their ability is. Before this, children who had physical disabilities would be in separate classrooms with children who had cognitive and developmental disabilities, when sometimes all they needed was the ability to enter a classroom. Under IDEA, schools are able to receive funding to make classrooms accessible for all students, allowing them to be mainstreamed instead of taught separately. Mainstream is a term that applies to deaf students and students with disabilities alike. Mainstreaming is when a deaf student or a student with a disability attends a school with their hearing and temporarily able-bodied peers with accommodations. Positives of mainstreaming include showing able-bodied and hearing students that disabilities and deafness is not something that should be feared or shunned, showing them that they're all kids, just that some are different than others. For mainstreaming to be successful, there needs to be support that allows the student to have equal access to what is being taught in the classroom. Some students do need to be in a different classroom to accommodate their disability, whether that's physical or cognitive, spending time with their peers during classes like gym, lunch, recess, and other activities. For deaf students, the support means having an interpreter who is qualified to be in their classroom and interpret the verbal component of the lesson into ASL and their answers from ASL into spoken English. If teachers are unable to accommodate mainstream students, those students can suffer and simply get passed along to the next grade instead of addressing the deficiencies in support at the school. And IDEA and its support, both legislatively and financially, comes from the U.S. government through the Department of Education, which is part of why the Department of Education is a very important governmental agency. But despite these pieces of legislation, not a lot was changing. Much of that was because the legislation wasn't being enforced, especially Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Section 504 says, quote, "No otherwise qualified individual with a disability in the United States, as defined in Section 705 of this title, shall, solely by reason of his or her disability, be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance," end quote. The problem is, the regulations for Section 504 had not been published because there was no way to enforce adherence to it. Despite the Rehabilitation Act having been signed into law in 1973, Section 504 was still unpublished 4 years later. The documentary Crip Camp features one of the most iconic of these moments of activism, in addition to the space created for kids with disabilities to be kids, which partially led to many of them becoming activists, Camp Jeanette. In 1977, there was an organized protest across the country to occur at regional offices of the United States Department of Health education, and welfare to protest the lack of publication and enforcement of Section 504. On April 5th, people with disabilities, their caregivers, and allies across the country went to picket or sit in at these offices. All but one location was dispersed after a little over a day due to lack of food and medication, either being removed by officials or waited out by officials. The occupation in San Francisco did not disperse after a day or even a week. The occupation at the office in San Francisco lasted for 23 days. They planned ahead and included interpreters, caregivers, and parents to help during the occupation. The protests were diverse in several ways, including deaf people, a long list of various physical and mental disabilities, genders, sexualities, and races. The support the group had cultivated before the protest with several groups, including the Black Panthers, queer groups, politicians, both local and national, unions, churches, and the Salvation Army, was highly important to the success of the occupation. The Black Panthers, for example, would bring in hot breakfasts or lunches as often as they could. Other groups would bring in medical supplies and food as needed. Everyone was cared for as needed, and spirits were kept up because they would socialize with each other, in addition to meeting to stay organized as the occupation continued. For many, this was their first time being around at least one other person with a disability, let alone such a large group. This protest drew a lot of the local media's attention and even got some attention from the national media outlets. One reason was because the protesters could communicate with the allies outside of the building. The presence of deaf people and interpreters meant that communication could easily flow through the windows of the building. Another was the fact that a bunch of people with disabilities were occupying a government building successfully. Eventually, politicians came from Washington, D.C. to hear grievances and demands, the biggest being that 504 regulations be signed and published as written without any changes. The protesters made sure they were fully understood and heard, advocating for themselves and others with disabilities across the U.S. instead of being placated by the politicians, who tried to placate them. They also had a lot of support outside as more people with disabilities and allies led protests daily in support of the occupation. 2 weeks into the protest, a highly diverse group was elected to go to Washington and work with other groups on the East Coast to get through to politicians there. Because there was little accessible transportation at the time, one thing enforcements of Section 504 would address, those who use wheelchairs traveled across the nation's capital in a U-Haul, yes, a U-Haul, donated by the local chapter of the International Association of Machinists. The goal was to meet with President Carter and pressure him to get the 504 regulations signed and published. But the president avoided them and would not meet with them. Eventually, due to the national coverage the protest was receiving, the regulations for Section 504 were signed and enacted. Upon hearing news of this, the protesters ended their occupation and left the building for the first time in 26 days. I highly recommend watching Crip Camp in general, but also the documentary The Power of 504, both of which go into this historic moment in much better detail than I can here. The links are below today's video. But this moment showed the nation what disabled people were willing and able to do, especially when they are fed up with the lack of access and respect. As I talked about last week, while some saw the passage of the Civil Rights Act as a victory that meant the movement ended, many others disagreed. While segregation and overt racism was made illegal in many ways, people found other ways to continue to oppress people based on race. Black people alone continued to face discrimination and oppression through redlining, hiring practices, and incarceration. So groups like the Black Panthers continued to fight for equality and kept the movement going. Another way the movement continued was through the creation of hip-hop. Hip-hop was born in large U.S. cities, especially the South Bronx, where blacks and Latinos were living in neighborhoods that were literally falling apart around them. The way infrastructure is supported in cities means low-income neighborhoods don't have the same hospitals, schools, fire departments, and local police that higher-income neighborhoods do. And the deindustrialization of the United States in the 60s and 70s didn't help. After World War II, there was a shift away from factory work and jobs that didn't require a high school education across the country. This led to mass unemployment in inner cities across the country, and New York City was no exception. In 1970, there were 1,445,000 of those jobs in New York City. By 1984, the number had dropped to 953,000. This caused people who could afford to move to find employment to do so, creating an increasingly concentrated population of poor families. Gang violence had started to increase again. Buildings were abandoned, falling apart, and/or on fire. There were empty lots full of rubble and rusting cars. Public housing was being built by the city municipality, and they filled up as soon as possible. It created areas that looked more like what was then called third world countries within the so-called first world United States. Between 1890 and 1930, the population of the Bronx grew more than 10 times, from around 89,000 to over 1.2 million people. People of all backgrounds were attracted to living in the Bronx because of the affordable cost of living. The East Tremont neighborhood became what sociologists call a staging area for families. People would move there when they had saved up enough money to move out of the slums. They would continue to save money and improve the lives of their families. Eventually, they would have enough to move to a new neighborhood, making room for a new family to move in and play their part in the cycle. The neighborhood had strong services, including schools, healthcare, and transportation that supported the residents. By the 1950s, the demographics had shifted to be mostly Jewish, but remained vibrant and strong. But this prosperity did not last. Due to legislations put in place by the federal government and city government that were intended to improve the lives of those living in the areas affected, as well as improvement projects by city planner Robert Moses, the Bronx soon found itself in trouble. In building public housing in inner cities, like the Bronx, it concentrated poverty in cities, often leading to high concentrations of Black and Latine populations. This new housing led people to move out of older buildings, leaving them empty and eventually abandoned because of the lack of income of tenants to keep them maintained. All of this led to what is known as white flight out of cities and into suburbs, further concentrating poverty in these areas. Influenced by these biases, banks started implementing redlining policies, further entrenching racial division. Many scholars identify the final nail in the coffin as the construction of the Cross-Bronx Express motorway. Robert Moses, city planner of New York City, an appointed official who was interested in the improvement of the Manhattan borough, had a vision for a highway that would connect Manhattan directly to the northeastern part of the country. This express highway, however, ran straight through the thriving Tremont neighborhood in the Bronx. While it didn't cover much in terms of land, it cost around $250 million to construct. It also required the demolition of 54 apartment buildings, 91 one- or two-family homes, and 60 stores, displacing families and business owners who left the Bronx and never came back. It was amid this desolation that a new subculture and music genre was born. The youth of the Bronx felt as though they were abandoned. The few schools that were open didn't provide them with an education that would help them get jobs and move to better areas. There was little support in general left in the South Bronx. Throughout the early 70s, the only support they found was in the gangs that divided the borough up. It was in the early 1970s that the rival gangs came together to sign a peace treaty to end the violence that was engulfing their borough. It was in this vacuum that hip-hop music culture developed. Hip-hop is comprised of four main areas: DJing, graffiti writing, breakdancing, and rapping. Each aspect came together to give the youth of inner cities a place where they were accepted for who they were. They felt like their concerns were being heard, empowering them to go out into the world and be successful. These components all had something in common. They all took something existing in their world and remixed it to make them their own. All of these aspects of hip-hop led to the empowerment of the artists and the audiences alike. One very important part of hip-hop is the Universal Zulu Nation, founded by DJ Africa Bambaataa, one of the three founding fathers of hip-hop. Bambaataa was born Lance Taylor in the South Bronx and was raised by his mother, who immersed him in the ideas from international Black cultural and liberation movements. By the age of 13, he had risen high in the ranks of the Bronx River Project's division of the gang Black Spades. His rank of warlord allowed him to be part of the peace process among the gangs in 1972. Due partly to the peace treaty and partly to the deaths of young Black men at the hands of police, he established the Bronx River Organization as an alternative to gang affiliation. It was about building a community based on peace and respect. 3 years later, in 1975, he won a writing contest, where the prize was a trip to Nigeria. He returned a changed man. He changed his name permanently to Africa Bambaataa, changed the name of the organization to the Universal Zulu Nation. The Zulu Nation was still about being a peaceful community for the youth of the area, but now it focused on doing so through DJing, breakdancing, and activism. It was a place where young people felt safe and supported in a world that was the opposite. Nothing about the Zulu Nation came from the dominant culture. It came from various movements within the Black community in America. Over time, rap scenes in other urban centers like Los Angeles, Detroit, and Chicago, to name but a few, developed and continued to thrive. For many today, hip-hop provides a safe space where they can be themselves and not fear violence, discrimination, and racism from others. While rap has, sadly, included violence against others, reigniting some of the culture that hip-hop was originally providing refuge from, that isn't always the case. Breakdancing, DJing, graffiti, and rapping are all ways for young people who feel oppressed, whether it's because they're Black, disabled, poor, Muslim, or queer, to voice their concerns and draw attention to the discrimination they face as well as celebrate the culture they are a part of. While the topic of rap songs varies from artist to artist, from place to place, and from time to time, part of rap has always been activism, also called raptivism. One of the earliest prominent examples of this is Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five's song The Message, which I have posted a link to below the lecture. Public Enemy's song Fight the Power, NWA's Fuck the Police, and Wu-Tang Clan's Protect Ya Neck are examples from the late 80s and early 90s. Contemporary artists who engage in raptivism include Kendrick Lamar, Common, and Childish Gambino. Over 30 years after the civil rights movement supposedly ended, Black people were still fighting against racial injustice and institutional racism. Today, raptivism continues to advocate for anti-racist policies and culture in the U.S. Just go watch Kendrick Lamar's Super Bowl halftime show or Hamilton. Hip-hop often gets dismissed as noise or trash, both visual and oral. What often gets missed is the point that many are trying to make, that we still are a racist country and need to remove it from our society and our world.